September 23rd, 1942. 12,000 feet above the English Channel. The morning sun cut through scattered clouds, painting the waters below in shades of steel and silver. Flight Lieutenant Alan Deere, a veteran of the Battle of Britain with 14 confirmed kills, led his squadron of Spitfire Mark I's in a routine patrol along the French coast. At 27 years old, the New Zealander had seen more air combat than most men would experience in a lifetime. He'd fought over Dunkirk, survived the desperate summer of 1940, and emerged as one of Fighter Command's most respected pilots. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for what was about to happen. Bandits, 11 o'clock high. The call crackled through his headset. Deere's eyes snapped to the left, scanning the sky. There, 6 contacts, diving from 18,000 feet with the sun behind them. Classic Luftwaffe tactics. His hand instinctively moved to the throttle, preparing for the familiar dance of combat. Messerschmitt 109's probably. The RAF had been fighting them for 3 years now. Dangerous opponents, certainly, but known quantities. Predictable. Except these weren't Messerschmitts. The first indication something was wrong came when the German fighters entered their dive. The acceleration was violent, aggressive, in a way that made Deere's combat-honed instincts scream warnings. These aircraft were heavier, more brutal in their movements. As they closed, details became visible through his gun sight. Radial engines, broad wings, a profile he'd never seen before. "What the hell are those?" His wingman's voice carried equal parts confusion and dawning fear. The answer came in fire and blood. The lead German fighter rolled inverted with a speed that seemed to defy physics. One moment, it was diving. The next, it was locked onto Sergeant Davis's Spitfire, its nose lit up with cannon fire. The British fighter simply disintegrated, not shot down, destroyed. Wings separated from fuselage. The cockpit section tumbled separately, trailing fire and debris. Davis never had a chance to bail out. Deere broke hard left, hauling his Spitfire into the tightest turn the Merlin engine's power could sustain. Standard evasive tactics. Every RAF pilot learned them. Turn tight, force the enemy to overshoot, reverse the situation. It had worked against 109's countless times. The strange German fighter followed him through the turn. Impossibly. The Spitfire was supposed to be the most maneuverable fighter in the sky. Yet this radial engine monster was staying with him, matching his turn radius, its rate of roll making Deere's aircraft look sluggish by comparison. He watched in horror as the German pilot simply rolled out of the turn, reversed direction faster than Deere could react, and positioned for a perfect deflection shot. Only Deere's combat experience saved him. He pushed the stick forward violently, diving away just as cannon shells tore through the space his aircraft had occupied a split second earlier. Below him, the battle had become a massacre. His 12 Spitfires were scattered across the sky, pursued by just 6 German fighters that were systematically destroying them. Pilot Officer Henderson went down in flames. Flight Sergeant Morrison's aircraft broke apart under cannon fire. Lieutenant Webster managed to bail out, his parachute blossoming white against the blue sky as his Spitfire spun into the channel. Deere pushed his Spitfire to maximum power, diving for the deck in the desperate hope that speed and altitude loss might save his life. Behind him, one of the German fighters followed effortlessly. The distance closed with terrifying inevitability. Deere jinked left, then right, then left again. Random evasive maneuvers designed to spoil the enemy's aim. Cannon shells walked up the water beside his aircraft, close enough that he could see the white geysers of impact. The German pilot was playing with him, demonstrating absolute superiority before delivering the killing blow. Then, miraculously, the attack stopped. Deer risked a glance behind. The German fighters were climbing away, returning to altitude. They'd expended their ammunition or reached their fuel limits, or perhaps they'd simply grown bored with the slaughter. Of the 12 Spitfires that had begun the patrol, 5 returned to base. 7 pilots were dead or missing. Not one German aircraft had been damaged, much less destroyed. Deer's combat report, filed 90 minutes later at RAF Tangmere, was brief and devastating. Encountered 6 enemy fighters of unknown type. Aircraft demonstrated performance superior to Spitfire Mark V in all parameters below 20,000 feet. Roll rate exceptional. Rate of climb exceptional. Armament appeared to be multiple cannon, possibly 4 or more. Current RAF fighters inadequate against this threat. Urgent evaluation required. The report landed on the desk of Air Commodore Peter Townsend at RAF Fighter Command Headquarters within hours. Townsend, himself a Battle of Britain veteran, read it with growing concern. Similar reports had been trickling in for weeks. Mysterious German fighters with radial engines, exceptional performance, devastating firepower. But Deer's account was the most detailed yet, and the most alarming. By late afternoon, Townsend had assembled a crisis meeting with representatives from the Air Ministry, RAF Intelligence, and the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. The question was simple but terrifying. Had the Germans achieved a decisive technological breakthrough? Wing Commander Ronnie Harker from Rolls-Royce's Flight Test Division provided the technical analysis. Based on these reports, we're looking at something fundamentally different from the Messerschmitt 109, a radial engine fighter optimized for low to medium altitude performance. The described roll rate suggests extremely effective ailerons, possibly power-assisted. The firepower reports, 4 to 6 cannon, indicate the Germans have solved weight and recoil problems we're still working on. Can the Spitfire compete with this aircraft? Air Marshal Trafford. Lee Mallory's question cut through the technical discussion. Harker's answer was blunt. Not the Mark V. Possibly not even the Mark IX when it enters service. If these reports are accurate, the Germans have leapfrogged our fighter development by at least a year, maybe more. The room fell silent. The implications were staggering. British air superiority, purchased with blood during the Battle of Britain and maintained through 2 years of grinding combat, was suddenly in question. If German fighters could dominate RAF formations over France and the Channel, the strategic bombing offensive would become unsustainable. Worse, if the Luftwaffe regained air superiority over England. We need one of these aircraft, Lee Mallory stated flatly. Intelligence, make it happen. Engineering, start working on countermeasures immediately. And someone tell me what the hell this thing is called. The answer came 3 days later from an intercepted Luftwaffe radio transmission. The mysterious fighter was the Focke-Wulf 190, and it was about to change everything. Kurt Tank's revolution. To understand why the FW190 represented such a leap in performance, you have to understand the man who created it and the revolutionary philosophy behind its design. Kurt Tank was not a typical aircraft designer. Born in 1898, he'd served as a cavalry officer in World War I before studying electrical engineering. His approach to fighter design was fundamentally different from his contemporaries. While Willy Messerschmitt pursued lightweight elegance and aerodynamic refinement, Tank believed in brutal simplicity, overwhelming power, and systems redundancy. The FW-190's development began in 1937 when the German Air Ministry issued specifications for a new fighter to complement the Bf-109. Most designers focused on liquid-cooled inline engines, like the Daimler-Benz DB601, which offered low frontal area and excellent aerodynamics. Tank chose the opposite path, a massive BMW 139 radial engine producing 1,550 horsepower. His design team thought he was insane. Radial engines were for bombers and ground attack aircraft, not fighters. The large frontal area would create terrible drag. The weight would destroy maneuverability. Fighter aviation wisdom of the 1930s said radials were obsolete for air superiority roles. Tank disagreed with every assumption. "We are not building a racing aircraft," he told his engineers at Focke-Wulf's Bremen Design Bureau. "We are building a weapon of war. It must be simple enough for mechanics to maintain in field conditions, powerful enough to carry heavy armament, tough enough to absorb battle damage, fast enough to catch enemy bombers, and maneuverable enough to defeat enemy fighters." The radial engine solved multiple problems simultaneously. Unlike liquid-cooled engines, which could be disabled by a single bullet through the cooling system, radials could lose entire cylinders and keep running. The BMW 801, which replaced the problematic 139 in production aircraft, was an engineering masterpiece. 14 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, producing 1,700 horsepower with an automatic engine management system that adjusted mixture, boost, and timing without pilot input. But Tank's real innovation was in how he integrated this massive engine into a fighter airframe. The FW-190's fuselage was carefully sculpted to minimize drag despite the large radial. A tight-fitting cowling with a ducted cooling fan pulled air over the cylinders with minimal frontal area increase. The aircraft's aerodynamics were refined through hundreds of hours of wind tunnel testing. The result was an aircraft that looked brutally functional. All business, no elegance. The cockpit sat high on the fuselage, giving the pilot exceptional visibility. The landing gear was wide-set and robust, making ground handling far easier than the narrow-track Bf-109. The wing was thick enough to house ammunition and weapons without external bulges, and the performance was revolutionary. The first prototype flew on June 1st, 1939. Test pilot Hans Sander climbed out of the cockpit after the 20-minute flight and made a statement that would prove prophetic. "This is not a fighter. It's a sledgehammer with wings." The FW-190's rate of roll was unlike anything flying. At speeds above 250 miles per hour, the pilot could move the stick from full left to full right deflection in less than a second, rolling the aircraft through 360 degrees before opponents could react. This came from exceptionally effective ailerons, mechanically connected to the control stick with almost no resistance, and a relatively low moment of inertia around the roll axis. Climb performance at low altitude exceeded the Spitfire and Bf 109. The massive engine's power-to-weight ratio at sea level was simply better than the competition. Where British Merlins and German Daimler-Benz engines were optimized for performance above 15,000 feet, the BMW 801 produced maximum power right at ground level. And then there was the armament. Early production FW 190A 1S carried four 7.92 millimeter machine guns and two 20 millimeter MG-FF cannon. By the time the A3 variant entered service in early 1942, the version that devastated Deere's squadron, the standard armament had increased to two 7.92 millimeter machine guns in the cowling, two 20 millimeter MG 151 cannon in the wing roots, and two additional 20 millimeter cannon in the outer wings. Total firepower, 6 weapons, 4 of them cannon, with a combined weight of fire that could destroy a heavy bomber in a single sustained burst. British fighters of 1942 carried 8.303 caliber machine guns, excellent for damaging fighters, but increasingly inadequate against heavily armored aircraft. The FW-190's cannon armament gave it a devastating first strike capability that RAF pilots simply couldn't match. The slaughter begins. The FW-190A entered combat operations with 2/JG-26 in August 1941, but initially in small numbers that allowed the RAF to dismiss early encounters as anomalies. By spring 1942, production had ramped up. An entire Jagdgeschwader were re-equipping with Tanks fighter. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. Fighter Command's Operational Research Section tracked the grim statistics. In March 1942, before FW-190's became common, RAF fighter squadrons operating over France achieved a roughly 1-to-1 kill ratio against Luftwaffe fighters. By June 1942, with FW-190's now dominant, that ratio had collapsed to nearly 4-to-1 in Germany's favor. British pilots were being slaughtered. Squadron leader Robert Stanford Tuck, one of the RAF's most successful aces with 29 victories, was shot down and captured on January 28, 1942, in one of the first major encounters with FW-190's. His Spitfire had been literally blown apart by a sustained cannon burst. Tuck, wounded and barely conscious, managed to bail out before his aircraft exploded. During interrogation, German pilots showed him gun camera footage of the engagement. Tuck watched in shock as his Spitfire, which he'd considered the finest fighter in the world, was systematically outmaneuvered by the German radial-engined fighter. The FW-190 had rolled with him through every evasive turn, matched his climb, and caught him in a dive he'd thought would guarantee escape. "I've been flying fighters since 1936, Tuck told his interrogators. "I've fought in France, over Britain, and over the Channel. That's the best fighter aircraft I've ever seen. If you have enough of them, you'll own the sky." The Germans, naturally, included his assessment in propaganda broadcasts. The psychological impact on RAF morale was significant. More devastating were the loss rates among less experienced pilots. Veterans like Deere might survive their first encounters through instinct and skill. New pilots, fresh from training, were being massacred. The operational lifespan of a replacement pilot in a Spitfire squadron operating over France dropped to an average of 4 missions, roughly 2 weeks. Flight Lieutenant James Johnny Johnson, who would become Britain's top-scoring ace of the war, described the grim reality in his memoirs. New pilots would arrive at the squadron full of confidence. They'd trained on Spitfires, practiced dogfighting, learned all the tactics. Then they'd encounter 190's on their first or second mission. If they survived, and many didn't, they'd land white-faced and shaking, talking about fighters that could do things Spitfires couldn't. The 190, didn't just beat us. It humiliated us. It could outturn us at high speed, outroll us at any speed, outdive us, and its guns would destroy our aircraft with single bursts. We were fighting with one hand tied behind our backs. The tactical situation became untenable. RAF policy called for fighter sweeps over France to draw the Luftwaffe into combat, allowing bombers to operate with reduced opposition. But German pilots, equipped with superior fighters, were happy to accept combat. The resulting engagements were predictable bloodbaths. On June 13, 1942, 12 Spitfires from 452 Squadron encountered 8 Fw-190's near Abbeville. The German formation was led by Hauptmann Josef Pips Priller, already an ace with over 30 kills. Priller's tactical approach demonstrated the Fw-190's advantages perfectly. Rather than engaging in traditional turning dogfights, where the Spitfire retained some advantages at lower speeds, Priller's formation executed high-speed slashing attacks. The Fw-190's would dive from altitude, building tremendous speed, roll inverted with their exceptional roll rate, fire devastating cannon bursts, then zoom climb back to altitude using their energy advantage. The Spitfires couldn't respond effectively. Their lower roll rate meant German pilots could reverse direction faster than British pilots could track. Their lighter armament meant even when they did get firing opportunities, hits that would damage an Fw-190 wouldn't necessarily bring it down. And their lower power-to-weight ratio, at low altitude, meant they couldn't climb away from danger. 8 of the 12 Spitfires were shot down. Not one Fw-190 was even damaged. Priller landed with ammunition remaining, having destroyed 3 Spitfires personally in less than 5 minutes of combat. The political crisis. By July 1942, the situation had become a political crisis. In the House of Commons, members of Parliament demanded answers about RAF fighter losses. Air Ministry officials, constrained by wartime secrecy, couldn't reveal the true extent of the problem without admitting British technological inferiority. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, briefed on the situation, understood the implications immediately. Britain's strategic position depended on air power. If the RAF lost air superiority over northern France, the eventual invasion of Europe would become impossible. More immediately, German air superiority could enable renewed bombing campaigns against British cities and industries. Churchill demanded immediate action. "I don't care what it costs," he told Air Marshal Charles Portal, Chief of the Air Staff. "Get me a fighter that can match this German aircraft, and get it quickly." The problem was that developing a new fighter from scratch would take years. Britain needed a solution in months, not years. The interim response came in 3 forms. First, rush the Spitfire Mark 9 into production. This version featured the more powerful Merlin 61 engine, with a two-stage supercharger, dramatically improving high-altitude performance. At altitudes above 20,000 feet, the Mark 9 could match or exceed the Fw-190, but below that altitude, the German fighter still dominated. Second, modify tactics. Squadron and wing leaders began teaching pilots to avoid low-altitude combat with 190's whenever possible. Stay high. Use altitude advantage. Dive through enemy formations rather than turning to fight. These tactics reduced losses, but felt like admission of defeat. RAF fighters running from combat rather than seeking it. Third, and most desperately, accelerate development of new fighters specifically designed to defeat the Fw-190 at the altitudes where it dominated. Enter Sidney Cam. At Hawker Aircraft's Kingston-upon-Thames design office, chief designer Sidney Cam was already working on the problem. Cam, designer of the legendary Hurricane that had saved Britain in 1940, had a reputation for practical, robust aircraft that could be built quickly and maintained easily. In late 1941, before the Fw-190's impact became fully apparent, Cam had begun work on a high-speed interceptor powered by the new Napier Sabre engine. This massive 24-cylinder H-configuration engine, with its sleeve valve design, promised over 2,000 horsepower, considerably more than the Merlin engines powering Spitfires. The resulting design, initially called the Typhoon, first flew in February 1940. But the Typhoon had problems. Serious problems. The engine was unreliable. The aircraft suffered from structural failures, particularly tail flutter at high speeds. Worst of all, performance at altitude was disappointing. The Sabre engine, despite its power, didn't perform well above 20,000 feet due to its low supercharger gearing. But Cam noticed something interesting in test reports. Below 15,000 feet, the Typhoon was phenomenally fast. At sea level, it could reach 380 miles per hour, faster than anything else flying. And with its 420mm cannon armament, it had firepower matching the Fw-190. The problem was that 380 miles per hour wasn't quite fast enough. Combat reports indicated Fw-190's could reach 390 to 395 miles per hour at sea level. Close, but in air combat, close meant dead. If an Fw-190 could outrun a Typhoon, even by a small margin, German pilots would simply refuse combat on unfavorable terms and escape. Cam needed more speed, which meant he needed to reduce drag. Through late 1942 and into 1943, while Fw-190's continued massacring RAF squadrons, Cam's team worked frantically on an improved version. They lengthened the fuselage, improving aerodynamic fineness ratio. They redesigned the wing with a laminar flow airfoil, thinner, more efficient, with carefully managed pressure distribution to minimize drag. They relocated the radiator from the chin position to wing root installations, reducing frontal area. They refined every surface, eliminated every protrusion, smoothed every rivet line. The result was the Hawker Tempest, and it would change everything. But getting it into service would prove almost as difficult as designing it. The Fw-190's golden age, throughout late 1942 and into 1943, the Focke-Wulf 190 established itself as arguably the most effective fighter aircraft in the world below 20,000 feet. Its dominance wasn't just about raw performance. It was about the complete package of capabilities that made it a pilot's dream and an enemy's nightmare. Hauptmann Adolf Galland, General of Fighters for the Luftwaffe, flew an FW-190 in November 1942 to evaluate it personally. His assessment, documented in his combat diary, revealed why German pilots loved the aircraft. Flugwerker today for 2 hours. Extraordinary aircraft. The visibility from the cockpit is exceptional. I can see everything. No blind spots. The controls are light and precise, responsive to the slightest input. Most impressive is the handling at high speed, where the 109 becomes heavy and unresponsive above 400 kilometers per hour. The 190 remains agile. I can roll, turn, and maneuver at speeds where British fighters are barely controllable. But what truly sets it apart, Galland continued, is the firepower. I conducted firing tests against ground targets. The combined cannon armament is devastating. I fired a 2-second burst at a truck from 400 meters. The vehicle simply disintegrated. Against aircraft, this concentration of firepower is overwhelming. Where the 109 requires precise, sustained fire, the 190 destroys with single bursts. This changes combat fundamentally. German pilots quickly developed tactics that exploited the FW-190's strengths while minimizing its few weaknesses. The primary weakness was performance degradation above 20,000 feet, where the single-stage supercharged BMW 801 engine lost power in the thinner air. Above 25,000 feet, Spitfire Mark 9s held significant advantages. The solution was simple. Don't fight above 20,000 feet. Luftwaffe fighter units operating over France established standard patrol altitudes between 12,000 and 18,000 feet. From these altitudes, they could see British formations approaching and choose whether to engage. If RAF fighters were higher, German pilots would simply wait. The British had to come down eventually, either to attack ground targets or return to England before fuel ran out. And when they descended, the FW-190s were waiting. Oberleutnant Walter, Count Punsky Krupinski, a rising ace with JG-52, who had finished the war with 197 victories, described the tactical situation. The English understand their disadvantage. They try to stay high, but this gives them limited options. If they want to attack anything on the ground, they must descend. If they want to escort bombers, they must fly at the bomber's altitude. And if they want to engage us, they must come to our altitude. In every case, they must fight where we are strongest. It is like choosing the battlefield before the battle. We have already won before engaging. The human cost. Behind the statistics and tactical analysis lay human tragedy on a scale that's difficult to comprehend from decades later. Young men, most barely out of their teens, were being sent into combat in aircraft they knew were inferior, against an enemy with better equipment and often superior training. Pilot Officer James Paddy Finucane, one of the RAF's brightest stars with 32 victories, understood the psychological toll better than most. In a letter to his family, written in June 1942, shortly before his death, he captured the grinding reality. The new German fighters are taking a terrible toll on the squadron. We lost 3 boys this week: Chapman, Davies, and young Henderson. Henderson was only 19, just finished training. His first combat sortie encountered 190s, shot down within 5 minutes. His wingman said he never had a chance. The German fighters are simply too fast, too well armed, too maneuverable at our operating altitudes. What makes it hardest, Finucane continued, is knowing we're sending these kids to almost certain death, and there's nothing we can do about it. We teach them tactics, we give them the best training we can, but the fundamental equation hasn't changed. Their fighters are better than ours. Experience and skill help. I've survived this long because I know what not to do. But eventually, luck runs out. You get bounced from the sun, or your engine fails, or you make one small mistake, and the 190's are there. Their cannons don't give you second chances. Finucane was shot down and killed by ground fire on July 15th, 1942, at age 21. He was one of the lucky ones. At least he knew what hit him. The psychological impact extended beyond just combat losses. Pilots who survived encounters with Fw-190's often returned visibly shaken, describing the experience in terms that suggested trauma. The overwhelming firepower, the aircraft's ability to seemingly appear from nowhere thanks to its roll rate, the sense of fighting an opponent who could dictate every engagement, all contributed to eroding morale. The Fw-19's golden age. Throughout late 1942 and into 1943, the Focke-Wulf Fw established itself as arguably the most effective fighter aircraft in the world below 20,000 feet. Its dominance wasn't just about raw performance. It was about the complete package of capabilities that made it a pilot's dream and an enemy's nightmare. Hauptmann Adolf Galland, General of Fighters for the Luftwaffe, flew an Fw-190 in November 1942 to evaluate it personally. His assessment, documented in his combat diary, revealed why German pilots loved the aircraft. Flugwerger, today for 2 hours. Extraordinary aircraft. The visibility from the cockpit is exceptional. I can see everything, no blind spots. The controls are light and precise, responsive to the slightest input. Most impressive is the handling at high speed, where the 109 becomes heavy and unresponsive above 400 kilometers per hour. The 190 remains agile. I can roll, turn, and maneuver at speeds where British fighters are barely controllable. But what truly sets it apart, Galland continued, is the firepower. I conducted firing tests against ground targets. The combined cannon armament is devastating. I fired a 2-second burst at a truck from 400 meters. The vehicle simply disintegrated. Against aircraft, this concentration of firepower is overwhelming. Where the 109 requires precise, sustained fire, the 190 destroys with single bursts. This changes combat fundamentally. German pilots quickly developed tactics that exploited the Fw-190's strengths while minimizing its few weaknesses. The primary weakness was performance degradation above 20,000 feet, where the single-stage supercharged BMW 801 engine lost power in the thinner air. Above 25,000 feet, Spitfire Mark 9s held significant advantages. The solution was simple: don't fight above 20,000 feet. Luftwaffe fighter units operating over France established standard patrol altitudes between 12,000 and 18,000 feet. From these altitudes, they could see British formations approaching and choose whether to engage. If RAF fighters were higher, German pilots would simply wait. The British had to come down eventually, either to attack ground targets or return to England before fuel ran out. and when they descended, the Fw-190's were waiting. Oberleutnant Walter, Count Punsky-Krupinski, a rising ace with JG-52 who would finish the war with 197 victories, described the tactical situation. The English understand their disadvantage. They try to stay high, but this gives them limited options. If they want to attack anything on the ground, they must descend. If they want to escort bombers, they must fly at the bomber's altitude. And if they want to engage us, they must come to our altitude. In every case, they must fight where we are strongest. It is like choosing the battlefield before the battle. We have already won before engaging. The human cost. Behind the statistics and tactical analysis lay human tragedy on a scale that's difficult to comprehend from decades later. Young men, most barely out of their teens, were being sent into combat in aircraft they knew were inferior, against an enemy with better equipment and often superior training. Pilot Officer James "Paddy" Finucane, one of the RAF's brightest stars with 32 victories, understood the psychological toll better than most. In a letter to his family written in June 1942, shortly before his death, he captured the grinding reality. The new German fighters are taking a terrible toll on the squadron. We lost 3 boys this week: Chapman, Davies, and young Henderson. Henderson was only 19, just finished training. His first combat sortie encountered 190's, shot down within 5 minutes. His wingman said he never had a chance. The German fighters are simply too fast, too well armed, too maneuverable at our operating altitudes. What makes it hardest, Finucane continued, is knowing we're sending these kids to almost certain death, and there's nothing we can do about it. We teach them tactics. We give them the best training we can, but the fundamental equation hasn't changed. Their fighters are better than ours. Experience and skill help. I've survived this long because I know what not to do. But eventually, luck runs out. You get bounced from the sun, or your engine fails, or you make one small mistake, and the 190's are there. Their cannons don't give you second chances. Finucane was shot down and killed by ground fire on July 15, 1942, at age 21. He was one of the lucky ones. At least he knew what hit him. The psychological impact extended beyond just combat losses. Pilots who survived encounters with Fw-190's often returned visibly shaken, describing the experience in terms that suggested trauma. The overwhelming firepower, the aircraft's ability to seemingly appear from nowhere thanks to its roll rate, the sense of fighting an opponent who could dictate every engagement, all contributed to eroding morale. Squadron leader Douglas Bader, the legendary legless ace, was shot down and captured on August 9, 1941, in one of the first encounters with production Fw-190's. During post-war interviews, he admitted the experience had shaken his confidence. I'd been fighting Jerry since 1940. Shot down over 20 of them. I thought I understood air combat, knew all the tricks. Then this radial engine fighter appeared, and everything I knew became obsolete. It outturned me, outrolled me, outclimbed me. The pilot, later learned it was Galland himself, played with me like a cat with a mouse. Every evasive maneuver I tried, he countered before I completed it. When he finally hit me, his cannon shells nearly tore my Spitfire in half. I barely got out alive. The Dieppe raid, August 19, 1942. The full extent of British fighter inadequacy became brutally apparent during Operation Jubilee, the disastrous raid on Dieppe. The operation called for landing Canadian troops on the French coast, supported by overwhelming air cover. Fighter Command committed 48 squadrons, over 300 fighters, to provide protection. The Luftwaffe responded with everything available, including multiple Jagdgeschwader equipped with Fw-190's. The air battle over Dieppe became the largest aerial engagement on the Western Front since the Battle of Britain, and it demonstrated conclusively that the RAF no longer held air superiority over northern France. Flying Officer Neville Duke, 112 Squadron, described the chaos. We arrived over the beaches at 0600 hours, 18 Spitfires tasked with bomber escort. The sky was already filled with aircraft, ours and theirs, completely mixed together. I'd never seen so many planes in one place. Then the 190's arrived. They came in formations of 6 to 8 aircraft, hitting us from multiple directions simultaneously. Our formation disintegrated within seconds. I saw Pilot Officer Mackenzie's Spitfire explode. Just gone. One moment flying, the next moment debris and smoke. No parachute. Lieutenant Thompson tried to turn with a 190. Bad decision. The German rolled inside his turn and shot him down. 2 seconds, maybe 3. That's all it took. Duke survived by diving to wavetop height and running flat out for England, several Fw-190's pursuing him across the channel. Only his Spitfire Mark 9's slightly better high-altitude performance, which translated to better speed at full throttle during his escape, saved his life. He landed at Hawking with his aircraft shot full of holes, fuel tanks nearly empty, and his hands shaking so badly he could barely complete the landing. The Dieppe statistics told a devastating story. The RAF lost 106 aircraft, with 67 pilots killed or missing. The Luftwaffe lost 48 aircraft total, with only about half of those attributable to British fighters. The rest fell to anti-aircraft fire. The engagement ratio in air-to-air combat approached 4-1 in Germany's favor. More significantly, Luftwaffe fighters had successfully attacked the landing forces repeatedly, despite facing supposedly overwhelming RAF fighter cover. The ground troops, pinned on the beaches, were strafed and bombed with impunity, while British fighters overhead were locked in desperate battles for survival against Fw-190's. The political fallout was immediate. Questions were raised in Parliament about Fighter Command's effectiveness. The Air Ministry, already working frantically on solutions, came under pressure to explain how Britain had lost air superiority so quickly. Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford Leigh-Mallory's report to the Air Ministry, classified secret until 1972, was blunt about the situation. The Focke-Wulf 190 has fundamentally altered the tactical balance over northern France. Our current fighters, primarily Spitfire Mark 1's and early Mark 9's, are inadequate against this threat below 20,000 feet. The Fw-190's combination of firepower, speed, maneuverability, and pilot visibility gives it advantages our aircraft cannot match at medium and low altitudes. The psychological impact on our pilots is severe, Leigh-Mallory continued. Experienced squadron leaders report increasing difficulty maintaining pilot morale. New pilots are being lost at unsustainable rates. Unless we can field fighters with performance matching or exceeding the Fw-190, Our ability to conduct offensive operations over France is in question. I cannot overstate the seriousness of this situation.